Hey, Bill. It's good seeing you again.
Hey,
You know,
Pete, good morning. Great to see you too.
yeah, it's been a couple years now since I retired. I mean, it's amazing to think about, 35 years in industry, 17 at Dow Chemical and 18 at Kimberly-Clark as chief scientist. And, now I've been retired for a couple years, and it's just great catching up with you and just kind of figuring out how we might reflect on what our careers look like and what we learned during our careers.
Yeah, Pete, I'm a little earlier into the retirement era. So as you know, I retired in May, so about 6 months ago. And similar, right? I spent my entire career at P&G, 33 years, or almost 33 years. Uh, and during that period, I feel like I learned so much about managing research and development. Uh, and reflecting back, so many of the things I learned, I didn't learn in graduate school and I didn't learn in my formal education. And it's just been something I've thought a lot about after I've left Procter and Gamble. And as you and I were talking over dinner not long ago, would love to find a way to bring some of those thoughts and ideas and concepts to life for the younger folks that have come behind us.
Oh man, I feel exactly the same way. There's just so many unspoken rules, in leadership. I mean, there's all kinds of formal training that you can get in leadership, how to manage people, how to do budgets, all the formal training, but there's just so many kind of unspoken rules, that you kind of learn by the school of hard knocks, and they're just, I mean, one of the ones that always comes to my mind is just how do you convince somebody that you have a good idea? It just seems like so many times in a company, if there isn't the organizational and political will, it doesn't matter how good the idea is, it's never going to happen. And so, how do we, you reflect back on your career, what are those incidences where you had a big idea or your team had a big idea and you kind of been hitting a brick wall, and how do you negotiate that for success, or how do you maneuver that for success? I mean,
Yeah,
do you have any
yeah.
experiences on that?
Oh, tons of experiences, Pete. That
Yeah.
question feels like my day-to-day life when I was working at Procter. Um, I think first you have to take a minute and think about, you know, is that idea something that naturally fits in the direction that the organization is going, or is it going to be a more disruptive idea? Because I think those are two very different things, right?
And we thought it was such a big idea. It was like, hey, it could go into all these different plastics. And the company was like, hey, we're not going to invest in research and development to work on all these other plastics for products that we don't even make. It's
Mhm.
like, come on, what are you thinking? And so, we put together this plan to spin the technology out into a whole, to a completely different company. And I remember pitching it to the CEO, and the CEO had four distinct reasons why he thought it wouldn't work. And I could have, it's one of these things that you got to determine, when do you persist and when do you pivot? And
Mhm.
so many times people pivot when they should persist, and they persist when they should pivot. And knowing when to do what is so important,
Yeah, yeah.
I kind of did a combination with the CEO. I took each one of his things that he was objecting about spinning it out, and we met week by week for like 4 weeks addressing each one of his issues till finally he agreed. He said, let's give it a try. And it's a company today called Void Technologies, that spun out from Kimberly-Clark with this nanovoided polymer technology. And they're focused on films, like packaging film, something KC would have never done. But it never would have happened if I didn't try to find out how I help the company win, the CEO win, and this new company win versus what I wanted to do. I had this idea of nanovoiding everything, and it was like, no, we're either going to nanovoid stuff for KC or we're going to do films, and so I had to back off of my big idea to get to ideas that worked.
Yeah. Pete, I think there's a really interesting theme, right? That maybe you could help the younger folks that might be listening in unpack a little more.
Yeah.
And that theme is how the question of pivot, persist, or stop changes during the course of the R&D work. Because by
Hmm.
its nature, you know, R&D takes on very challenging things, and you're
Yeah.
never going to have a 1,000 batting average, right? You're never going to succeed on every project you run. And so part of the manager's job is also to really call out when it's time to stop, right? An example you just gave, you know, you persisted, but it
Yeah.
sounded like you made a number of very smart strategic decisions along the way, both for the project and managing the senior decision makers. So could you maybe unpack how you were managing that decision making and management of project and people over time? What did you need to see at different milestones to help build your personal confidence versus just blindly saying, "Hey, I'm in love with my idea and I'm gonna live or die on this thing," right?
Yeah.
Talk a
Yeah.
little
Well,
bit
you know,
about the thought
what,
process.
yeah, no, early on when I was leading corporate research at Kimberly-Clark, um, I was really frustrated because I felt like we were like a heat-seeking missile, trying to follow the business wherever it was going with technology, and they were always changing where they were going. And so we were developing technology that ultimately was never going to be commercialized by Kimberly-Clark. We tried to license the technology, we tried to do other things with the technology, but they're all projects, quite frankly, we should have stopped
Mhm.
because where I got to was this idea of really sitting down with the business unit and saying, listen, we can't work on these corporate research projects unless we have at least three things. One is, what is the consumer insight? What's the real, accepted consumer belief that creates some tension in their life that needs to be resolved? And then the second thing was, how does this link to the brand promise?
Mhm.
I mean, what is it that the brand is actually promising the consumer to kind of solve their tension? And then the third thing I used to ask for is, what's the claim that we actually want on the outside of the box at the end of the day? It's like, and I used to tell researchers all the time, if you don't know the insight, the brand promise, or what the actual, claim is going to be on the box, push back. Say, hey, we can't work on this until we really understand these things. What I'm saying is it's so important to stop the work when you don't have a clear pathway to business success.
Mhm.
Let me just go one more
Well,
thing on this.
let me just add
Go
on
ahead.
to that real quick, and
Yeah,
then I'll
please.
go back. Right.
No,
I think
please.
my world, mirrored yours, almost exactly. I think I'd use slightly different language, but same concept of everything we're doing in the R&D world better be delighting the consumer, improving the lives of the consumer, and adding value to the brand or to the business. Right.
Yeah.
We had a very similar sort of mantra, philosophy, if you will. One of the things that we started to do, and I think everybody that listens in on this kind of conversation, you should find a way to think about this in your business, whether you're working for a chemical company, consumer product company, pharmaceutical company, ag company, right? What you're doing in R&D better delight the end user of that product. We came to a thought, though, adding on to that, taking that to another level of, can you prove that early on in a project lifecycle? So can you
Mm,
get to an MVP, a minimum viable prototype? Might not meet all the success criteria of the projects, but can you put something together to prove? So in your cooling project, right, can you get something down on tissue that will show this really works, right? Because
yeah.
then the project moves out of the, I have a business uncertainty and a technical uncertainty, and it moves into, hey, I know there's a target to hit. If I hit that, I'll deliver business. Now I'm just running a project that has technical uncertainty. And I think as R&D people, we're much better at managing that. I
Yeah.
always struggled on projects where we had to manage both uncertainties at the same time. And I can tell you in my career, I think I'm over 100 on those kind of projects, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not that we were 100% on the R&D only risk ones, right?
No,
But at least we're in
no,
the
yeah.
game. At least we're in the game, and we've got a shot at winning those, right? So
Yeah,
anyway, just
well,
I want to build on the thought while it was center stage in your example.
yeah, no, Bill, that's great. You know what? I'd love to know if this fits your experience. What I saw over my 35 years is innovations failed because of one of five reasons, and it's almost like if all five aren't there, the whole thing falls apart. So the first was a value proposition that the consumer actually
Yeah,
understood and believed.
yeah,
The
yeah.
second one was a business model where you could actually make money and all your partners could make money,
Mhm.
right? An
Yep,
acceptable
yep.
return on their investment. The third was a go-to-market strategy that you could actually execute through either existing channels or new channels you had to create. The fourth one is really key, is an innovation, a pipeline of innovation. What I saw so many times is we had a one-trick pony. We put something on the shelf, but we didn't have the
Yeah.
multitude of, to create anticipation in the consumer. iPhone does that every year. We're waiting for September to get the iPhone. We don't know what it is, but they've created that anticipation. And the fifth is a technology that gives the consumer and the business a reason to believe at a price they can afford. And if you
Mhm.
don't have those five things, I mean, any one of them, if you even just one of them can be missing, and the whole thing
Right.
falls apart. And I've just
No,
seen that play out multiple times in my career.
I think that's a great list, Pete. I think what I would say is my going back to the theme of our conversation, right? Kind of those lessons you learn in your career that you don't get taught, right? Is as managers, then how do we help our project teams by de-risking projects by taking some of those risks off the table early? Because if the project carries all five of those risks from the day you start until 1, 2, 3, 4 years later, right? Those projects are always going to be incredibly risky. Or if you
Yeah.
have projects where you can't figure those things out until the company invests millions and millions of dollars,
Yeah.
those become really, really risky projects. And, those are things that ideally need to be avoided. So I think part of our job is to say, how do we eliminate some of those risks? My goal is always to eliminate the consumer and the business risk as early as possible, so I could get the team focused on R&D risk. Because then you fail because you can't make the polymer at the cost you need to make it at, right? You can't engineer the enzyme to do exactly what you need it to do, right? But those are R&D problems, not business problems.
Bill, could one of the things that I think that you really do well is build external partnerships and create external partnerships to create win-win arrangements. And that's something nobody is really, I mean, you're taught negotiation skills, and those type of things, but that doesn't really help you build strong partnerships that create true win-win. I mean, that's something I know you have really done well over your career. I mean, could you talk a little bit about the secrets of building meaningful partnerships to move innovation forward?
Yeah, Pete, I tell you, it's a great question and something I really had a lot of passion for in my career. And I've had this discussion with a lot of people inside of Procter as well. Like, how do we create this external, what we call connect and develop, but this external ecosystem that we could really, really co-create and jointly grow both companies' businesses, right? So I work with all the big chemical companies in the world, quite honestly. And we started on the journey probably 20 years ago. I think I'd say we got pretty good at it 10 years ago. I think over time we've improved. And to your point on negotiation, I think a lot of the negotiation skills we learn in the classroom, to me, it always felt like going to buy a car, right? It's like, how do you get the best deal when you buy the car? How do you get the best deal when you buy the house? I think when you start to work on joint development projects with companies, it's not as much about how do I get the best deal on a single project. It's how do I create a win-win partnership that's going to last a period of time. So I don't want to run one project with, think about the companies, the BASF, the Dow Chemical, the DuPont, IFF, Firmenich, Genencor, Monosol, Milliken, Panshokabai, Shell, Sasol, all these people that are doing great things to support our business, right? We have to hit success criteria. There is some hard negotiation that has to happen, but I'm in it with them for the long term. Now I've kind of reframed what we're trying to do. We're trying to build a partnership. We're trying to build a portfolio of projects, and we're trying to do R&D work together. Take this idea of one team, but working for two different companies. How are we going to go create that, right? And I think that was the job. So the first step on this journey was reframing what we're trying to do, right? Mm. We're not trying to get the last drop of blood out of our partner. We're not trying to burn their resources on things that aren't going to create value for them. We're trying to create win-wins, create one team, get them focused on the biggest opportunities, right? And create a decade plus long partnership. So that was step one. Step two was really, really making sure the programs we put on the table to work on already had met those business delighting things that you talked about. Mm-hmm. Because we don't want 10 high risk projects running. All right, you got to have some things that have a reasonable chance of success, and a few of the moonshot programs built in there, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then you have to create a structure where you've got lead teams, you've got partners, and you're knitted together at all the levels. So you've got to have the scientists working with each other transparently. You've got to have the managers of the project teams working, those first level managers. You got to have the more senior managers that are looking at the whole portfolio, making decisions, pivoting, persevering, or stopping. And then quite honestly, you have to have the top level managers. You have to have the executives bought in to the partnership. And so there was a lot of time, blood, sweat, tears that went into these partnerships, right? It's not a toss it over the fence activity. It is we're coming together and we're going to be partners, or we're going to be partners for a long time. And yeah.
The other thing that happens in those type of partnerships, at least through my experience, is these it's almost like what gets unspoken. It's like so many times, we know what's going on within our company. They know what's going on within their company, and there's this little Venn diagram where the intersection happens. And so, one of the things that I always try to get to is, what's the question behind the question, or what's the answer behind the answer? Because what gets said isn't necessarily the entire story. And so I think, again, the people listening, to really think through how to ask really good questions, how to get to first principles, how to put yourself in the other people's shoes to try to really understand what is it that they need to be successful. And quite frankly, sometimes we just don't ask the question of, hey, what do you need here to make this, it's almost like, it's like, I got mine and you got yours. It's like, to really get in a room with the key people and just ask, hey, what is it that we need? What do you need? What do you need to take back? What would help you be a hero in your organization? Right? It's like, help us help you, help them be successful, and really go in with that mindset again, versus how do I just beat you? And I know that's your mindset too.
What has to be? I mean, Pete, if you're in it, for a decade-long idea, right? Like, we're going to build this partnership. It's going to be a marriage. We're going to both create value. You've got to help the party create value. So I've got a couple of really interesting examples, if you give me a minute. And one turned into a failure and one turned into a success. But both, I think, we look back and say we got to the right decisions quickly. So we're doing a project with one company, And I love your example of, or your statement of, here's the 5 things that need to be true for a successful project, and any of these 5 can kill a project. So we were stuck on a project where we'd shown the consumer value, we had shown the molecules worked, we had shown the formulations worked, we knew how to make these molecules in the lab. We had a partner that we had been with for a couple years on this journey, and we could just not get to a place where the economics, right, the operation cost and the capital cost made sense. We had an idea of what would make sense. We knew what we could afford and what the consumers would pay. Our partner had their own models on how that would work. And we would go to lead team meetings. We'd talk about it. We'd say, hey, we think there's still overlap between what we can afford for this and what you can make it for. We think there's still overlap. There's still opportunity. Let's keep going. Let's keep cranking away on driving out all the non-value added elements and see if we can get there. And after one of the lead team meetings where it felt like we hadn't made progress in a couple months, there was a small group of us. It was like 4 people sitting in a room.
I've seen it so many times, that, there's 20 issues that need to be resolved on a project, but only 3 are critical.
Yep.
And it's like you get all these people working on the other 17, and the other 17 don't even matter if we don't solve these 3. And so, one of the things I always encourage teams to do is to take issues and actually put them on a 2x2 of impact and uncertainty. And those projects with high business impact and high uncertainty, those are the only things that you need to work on. And you don't need to get uncertainty down to 0. You just need to get it past a threshold. And the other 17 can wait, And so one of the things that I always try to really force teams to think about is get to know quickly. Either NO, we're not going to do it, like your first story, or KNOW. Now we know what we need to do to make it work, right?
I like
And so
that.
if you can get to know quickly, either NO or KNOW, I mean, as quickly as you possibly can, that's where the value is created. And that's
Yeah.
where you also don't destroy value. I mean, how much value gets destroyed in an organization by continuing to work on the 17 when the 3 are the only thing that you need to be working on?
Yeah, at Procter, we had a pretty disciplined master plan. So we had a 5-year master plan that everything I worked on had to dovetail into this master plan. At some point, we had to give the business input to say, hey, we're reasonably sure we can hit this. Put us on year 3, year 4, year 5, year 2, right? But we had to constantly reconnect with, are we still on track or not? So we weren't at KNOW or NO while we're having those discussions. But if we're not working on those killer issues, we're just working on, showing how beneficial the idea could be. All of a sudden, we got pretty late in the process, and we'd have to kill it and move to the backup plan. And I can tell you, that destroys a lot of trust and a lot of credibility. So I think this is one of those critical skills that managers have to develop. I think the challenge, though, that I had, and I'm sure, you may have had in your career as well, is how do you get to the NO decision? Because there's always another idea. I mean, we have brilliant scientists that work for these companies, right? They always have the next idea, right? I know this failed. We can't get the product stable. It changes color. It's got whatever issue. Doesn't meet cost. We're still working around an IP challenge, but this next idea can solve all of that. And if that one fails, the next idea can solve all of that, right? So even when you're focused on those 2 or 3 killer issues, as a manager, how did you learn to decide when NO was the right choice with your project teams? Any examples you can share with us?
Well, there was examples where everybody in the organization was telling a researcher no, not to work on something. But they were so passionate on the idea that I supported them. And in a number of cases, it turned out to be a really good risk I took, if you will. But what I always tried to do, and I learned this at Google, we went to Google Garage one time, out of Google, and everybody probably knows about this, but what Google shared with us was this idea of 70-20-10. That 70% of all their investment goes into search, 20% goes into things that add on to search, like maps, and then
Hmm.
10% go to these really crazy ideas like self-driving cars. And so that 70-20-10 is, I kind of brought that back to the corporate research group and was like, 70% of everything we do should be for the core business, helping the core business lower cost, gain greater value, gain greater volume, but it's got to be just for the core business.
Yeah.
20% should be for adjacencies. Hey, we're, in whatever, adult incontinence today. Maybe we could be in adult incontinence wipes tomorrow. It's like,
Mhm.
hey, that's how would we do that? How can we take baby
Yeah.
wipes and adult incontinence and kind of move into this space? Let's work on some stuff that looks like that. And then the 10% was those things that were really risky, that everybody was saying no, that the researcher had a lot of passion for. And I took a risk on that, but you can afford to do the 10% if the 70 and 20 is paying all the bills. And so
Right.
you can't put all your efforts on the 10%. Because if you do, I mean, just like your portfolio at home, you're saving for retirement. You got to have, you got to, the whole bond stock, and well, I'm going to buy Nvidia. I'm going to take a 10% on Nvidia, or Bitcoin or whatever it might be. But yet, so that's the way I always approached it, Bill. Was I tried to really take a portfolio view, and because the thing I found was that every project on its own in isolation looked really, really good. And it's like you kind of had to take that project and put it in the context of the entire portfolio, and then you could make a choice. And then you could, but you did have to be able to tell people no, to really know, okay, when, when do we really stop a project? What was going through my mind? I mean, one of the things that I used to always tell my team, and I actually learned this from my dad, was never accept no from anybody that doesn't have the authority to tell you yes. And it was just like so many times that people were working on something and they were getting a no, but it was like that person couldn't have given you the yes in the first place. Why are you listening to that no?
Yeah.
Let's get to the person who can actually tell us yes or no. And so I always felt like that was my job, especially on the 70, like you're saying, is get to the P&L owner. If the person wasn't pounding on their desk, where is my whatever, it wasn't worth it. But you could get that P&L owner, and they really needed this for their business unit, and they were going to support it. So on the 70%, I always drove for P&L, get to know quickly, and that
Yeah.
was really vital.
Yeah. No, I think that's great advice for people, right? And I think as managers, knowing who those individuals are, there's a lot of discernment that has to happen to figure that out. Because in
Yeah.
big organizations, you and I had our careers in big Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies, and a lot of egos, a lot of opinions. People are very open to sharing their thoughts and opinions with you, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the same kind of thing, naively thinking that, it's like if you check all the boxes, or if you run it through the algorithm and it gets a high score, that isn't it obvious that this is and so many times researchers just kind of present things to you as if it's just obvious, and one of the things is that I think researchers need to realize is that they know more about their project than anybody else, and so many times you've got to be able to explain it in a way. I always told researchers that the best way to sell anything to anybody is to transfer your enthusiasm for it to the other person. And once they're as enthusiastic about you as you are about your project, you've sold them. So don't try to necessarily always sell on facts, but try to sell on enthusiasm as well. And that was probably one of my pitfalls, Bill, is I guess I'm a pretty good salesman. I think sometimes I would oversell things, I mean,
Yeah.
and I learned a really important lesson because, there'd be some project that I really saw the merits in, And I would talk to senior leaders, and I would get those senior leaders as enthusiastic about it as I am,
Yeah.
but it hasn't been proven yet. And then I would get, information from a peer, another VP in the business unit saying, "Hey, I went in to go talk to the CEO about my project, and they're asking me about this technology I've never heard of before and how it applies to my project." And so I learned a really important lesson. Selling is important, but overselling can be
Yeah.
a death nail. And so again, one of the things I think you and I are trying to help people listening to this call about the unspoken rules is balance. We've been
Hmm.
talking really about knowing when to persist, when to pivot, when to sell, when to undersell or oversell, or it's all about balance. And the unspoken rules are really about balance. And I guess I would encourage anybody listening to this call down the path before. They're the pioneer that's got arrows in them. Find those pioneers with arrows in them, and learn from their mistakes. And one of the things I think I've found is that people are really generous with their time. If you
Yeah.
approach a senior person in an organization to really understand what their experience was and what insight they have on the unspoken rules to help guide you on your path to make your project successful. There's hardly anybody I've ever met in my entire career that wouldn't give you time to help you do that. I mean, I think that's what you and I are trying to do right now in this conversation.
Right.
But I would encourage any young person listening, or any person in their career listening to this conversation, to know there's unspoken rules, to seek out those unspoken rules, and to find the balance in what you're trying to do.
Well, and Pete, I mean, combined, you and I have, close to 70 years of experience in industry, right? And I think I'm speaking for you. I mean, I felt like I was learning these skills up until the day I retired, right? So I got pretty good at quite a few things. I've got a lot of arrows in the back as well from making lots of mistakes. Um, but I was always trying to help people to learn those lessons as well, because it's so important, right? And these are lessons you just don't learn in school, right? I was reflecting back recently that, I went through undergraduate, I did a PhD, I learned a lot about chemistry, right? Learned a lot about how to do innovation. I didn't learn anything about how to be a manager, right? All of my learning how to be a manager was taking some external managerial courses after I started my professional career. And that was probably, 5% of the learning. I think 95% of the learning was on the job training, and much of it was failures, right? Boy, did that wrong. How do I think about that again? And reflecting on a lot of the failures I had, right? I think the point you made a moment ago was one that rose to the top in my mind, which was balance. I think a lot of the failures that I experienced and I learned from is when I got out of balance. I got over exuberant, over promising, right? Not focused enough on the killer issues, focusing too much on the excitement of the delight, etc. Right? And I think when you step back and say, okay, am I taking a balanced approach to this? Right? Am I focusing on the issues and the benefits? Right? Am I asking those hard questions of the teams? Right? Am I giving them too much rope, not enough rope? Have we run this project too long, or have I not run it long enough? Right? I think just thinking hard about that, and then super important. I love the point you just made of develop mentors, develop people that can help you on the journey. Right? Because tons of people, you and I included, but tons of people are more than willing to help others on the journey because they lived it, right? So don't think that the VPs in your company today or the CEOs in your company didn't make the same damn mistakes, didn't go through the same learning cycles, right? They have the same stories that we have, right?
Yeah.
They and you and I would love to see people just develop faster, right? You know,
Yeah.
take a few
Yeah.
of these
And,
ideas and
and,
see if they help you.
and well, that's the message I would have for anybody listening that is in a senior role, is to humble yourself a little bit and go help somebody in you see somebody struggling, you've been there before. Don't let them struggle. Reach out, and provide some guidance. So, yeah, Bill, I mean, it's always so great connecting with you. I always learn so much from you, and I hope we can continue these conversations about unspoken rules and to help others learn from our success and our failures, quite frankly. And I think through this process, I think you and I both continue to learn. I think we're both lifelong learners, and we want to
Yeah.
continue to learn and contribute. That's for sure. I keep
No.
calling my retirement my renaissance, not my retirement. I'm in my renaissance phase, or rewirement, re-inspirement. I've heard it all these things. But yeah, so it's just so
Well, Pete,
great.
one of the things you and I have talked about, right, is, and I haven't learned how to do it yet, right? But one of the things I really want to try to do in retirement is figure out how to help other people. And so, whether that's through what did we learn about the unspoken rules of leading R&D groups, or how do we approach developing mentors? How do we approach figuring out those killer issues on projects? I'd love to find a way to just give that back to more and more people, right? So, as folks are out there, and hopefully there are a few that will listen to us talk through this little conversation tour, I would open it up that, I think we're both on LinkedIn. I think we both respond generously. So if folks outside, heard something that they feel like they'd like to dig into more, unpack more, ask more questions about, please, please, please reach out. I'm in retirement. I've got a lot of time to help people at the moment.
Yeah, I'm the same. I'd be happy to really take any connection and help with my network or help with my experience. So I agree with you 100%, Bill. So
Awesome.
hey, cool, man. It was so great to see you.
Yeah, you as well. You as well. I'm sure we'll stay in touch.
All right.
All
Have a
right.
good day. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.